If you hate money and like Glocks, this video is for you. If you like Glocks and want to hate money, this video is also for you. In this video, I do a shootout between the Glock 45, the Zev OZ9 Hypercomp, and the DC Precision DC9R. If you've been following my series on these three guns, you'll find that they have three different price points and all have different purposes. Now, the fun thing is when we actually get them all together and see what they actually do. Now, for this video, I really wanted to answer the question of what does your investment get out of these guns, because they are three very different price points. Now, in the other videos, I went over them very extensively, so if you want to check them out, I'll leave the links in the description below so you can take a look at each gun's review individually if you so choose. Now, our first contender is the Glock 45. At an MSRP of $620, this is going to be the bang for your buck gun. Now, particularly this one, I did buy this one used for $515, but it was slightly used and is the gun I used to build the budget build for Carry Optics and IDPA and USPSA. But for all intents and purposes, the gun is still practically new and will be our budget entry for this shootout. Now, just real quickly here, if you're not familiar with the Glock 45, it's basically a Glock 19 slide with a 4-inch barrel, and the grip module itself is a full size, similar to what you would find on a Glock 17. So it's kind of the best of both worlds of being a fairly small gun, but yet a full-size grip for someone with large hands like me to get my hands on it. And then our next contestant is the more eccentric Zev OZ9 Hypercomp X. Now, that X particularly stands for a larger grip module on here, indicative of a 1911 grip angle and a larger footprint similar to a Glock 17. At an MSRP of $1,899 on their website, it is 3 times the cost of the Glock 45, and so plenty of questions that arise follow that. And interestingly enough, when you put them side by side, they are incredibly similar in footprint and size. Now, this slide is about the size of a Glock 19 footprint, and the barrel is 4 inches with 4 ports to help mitigate the muzzle lift of this, and it does its job effectively. And so because it's about the same size and footprint as the Glock 45, you can actually use identical holsters for them. You just got to remember with the Zev is it's slightly wider, that if you were to use a comp tack holster, that you may have to put longer screws in it for it to work. Now, with that said, you just back them out and simply the gun just will fit right in at that point. But just remember that the Zev slide is a little bit wider than your traditional Glock slide. And one of the other attributes to particularly with the Zev is that it has a fire control unit inside, similar to what you would find on SIG P365s and 320s, and you can mix and match this gun as you please. So they do make smaller grip modules for this gun, so if you want to carry it or have a slightly smaller footprint when you do, you can do that. And of course, there are different options for slide and so forth, and that is the beauty in what you invest in. Partially what these Zev is the modularity. Now, speaking of another modular type gun, we got our heavyweight contestant here at a hefty 44 ounces. It's significantly heavier than the 2 other guns, but yes, at an MSRP of $5,000, now that's 2.5 times more than the Zev. It starts the question is, what do you get out of this gun? And so this is the DC Precision DC9R. And it is actually truly something special, because this gun feels just right in the hands. And well, before we dive more into it, I mean, you'll really start to see right off the bat that you do have something special. You will have the modularity in which the slide, and it's a frame, and the grip are all 3 different components, yet fit nice and tightly. But this is our heavyweight contestant for price right here. Now, starting with our first impressions, the Glock 45 is a very utilitarian looking and very utilitarian in fit and finish on this gun. It is made to function over and over again for high round use and reliability, and you can start to manipulate it. Everything is just right in terms of its practicality. You don't have these really thick serrations, but they aren't slippery and they're just enough. And what I've come to appreciate is that the trigger on the Gen 5 Glocks are nice. They have just a little bit of take up, and you get to a wall, a little bit creep and a break, and it's a nice 5.5 pound break, which feels significantly lighter than older Glocks I've shot. This particular generation has had an improvement in the trigger, and when you get to the reset, puts you right on the wall with no creep, and boom. Now, the other one, as I'd mentioned earlier, is the more eccentric Zev OZ9 Hypercomp. When you're looking at it, it definitely sticks out as something that's meant to say, hey, I'm different and I'm here to let you know it. The serrations are much deeper and much more aggressive. It's nice that they have just a little bit of beveling on the edges, so the fit on this when you press check it or you just rack it from the top is actually more conforming than the Glock. You do have the ported island barrels, which is a nice feature as it creates a nice lockup, and it's nice firm and fit as you kind of just wiggle around the slide and frame. You know, it's a nice tight fit, and a large part of that too is when you start to open this thing up, you'll see that the frame rails are a little bit larger, and it's kind of interesting as they have subtle cutaways just more for oiling and also to accommodate the tighter tolerances that this gun produces. Now, tighter tolerances usually do equate to higher levels of accuracy and precision, and that's what this gun does very well. Now, additionally, I did mention that this was a full-size grip earlier, and this makes this gun an ideal fit in the hands. What I really love about the Zev OZ9 Hypercomp is that this thing is so natural in the hands. The weight is where you want it. I would say with the Glock 45, the weight's a little bit more top-heavy, but this feels right in the hands, and that's what you start to see where your investment goes with this. You see the tighter tolerances, you see the things that stick out, and you know, the fit and finish of it is what really kind of starts to say, hey, I am paying for a little bit more. The grip texture is even actually effective in comparison to the Glock, but not overly aggressive. So if you wanted to carry it daily, I would say it's more than suitable. But this is a very optimized platform of the Glock. When you pull the trigger on it, it's a very nice, just very subtle like the Glock, and just a nice break. I would say that the break is a little bit more crisp in comparison to the Glock, and that's because when you go with Zev, you're really trying to pull the best parts out of their bin that they've optimized over the years. It does break at 4.5 pounds, and I'd say that's about right, because I think that's a good balance between if you want to shoot this gun for competition or you want to carry it. I think 4.5 is a pretty solid balance between the two, and that's what they've really achieved well with this gun. The one odd gripe I have with a gun that you pay nearly $2,000 for is the mags that come with them. Now, I would assume because this is an American gun made in America that, you know, they may have restrictions on putting factory Glock mags with this, and also they're not in the magazine making business. That said, you end up getting 2 Magpul magazines with them, and my gripe more so is that they don't feel consistent with the quality that you do buy with this gun. And what I've always ended up doing with all the Zevs I've owned is kind of tossing the Magpuls aside and end up using factory Glock mags. But not to really harp on Magpul, the mags actually do work and are sufficient for what they do. They just don't feel consistent with the price point that you get with this gun. And the one that makes the best first impression is definitely going to be the DC9R. If it's not the color that captivates it, it's actually looking at it and saying, okay, wait a minute, what is this? And it's definitely different when you look at it. And what's interesting is it doesn't need the type of standout features like you would see with the Zev. It's a lot more subtle, a lot more conforming, and a lot more elegant. And that's pretty consistent with when you think about some of the more luxury item things of life, that everything starts to be more streamlined, intentional, and useful, and yet actually timeless in design. And that's what DC Precision nailed perfectly with the DC DC9R. I mean, the gun is definitely something different when you look at it. You know right away there's some subtleties that seem familiar of a Glock, such as the slide, which it is actually particularly about the size of a 19 because it's a 4.5-inch barrel model version of this. And so if you were to compare these slides side to side by these, they'd be about the same size. And when you start to manipulate this gun, you just really feel how tight and how solid everything is. You could tell that they spent a lot of time actually fitting and making sure everything was perfect. Now, working our way around our gun, the serrations are perfect. Not too deep, not too harsh, and you just can get right in there. And the whole entire thing, man, this is like the best part. It's just racking this thing. It is just, there's no play in this gun whatsoever, and that takes hours to get to that point. And so the contributing things that make the tolerances so tight are also that the frame rails are significantly larger than the two other guns that we have here, and they're solid flat with just oil galleys in them just so they can retain oil or grease, whatever you decide to go with. But the tolerances are so tight on this gun, and what that equates to in the hands is a gun that feels firm and confident. Now, to add to that, it does comp up the top here, and I can tell you this is a shooting experience like I've never really experienced, and I would say arguably one of the softest, flattest shooting guns out of the box I've ever shot. Another supporting factor of that is that this gun does weigh quite a bit at 44 ounces with an empty magazine in it and the optic, and so the complete package is just more in general, which between the natural attributes of the low bore axis and all the fine tuning done to it creates a shooting experience like none other. And that's what you really start to see in this gun, is that everything is done to the maximum limit of what you can actually do with the Glock platform. Now, as I'd mentioned earlier, it is modular in design, with everything pretty much from barrel and frame up and trigger group being Glock, but the frame is actually made of steel. It's a modular piece like you would see with like a 2011. Now, the grip is actually made of aluminum to help with the balance of the gun rather than just being steel, and it shows because the fit in your hands, I talked about the Zev being a good balance, but this is perfect. You will get this gun and know that immediately that you have something special. To top it off, the trigger is amazing. I mean, it's this machine flat piece with virtually no pre-travel and just a touch of creep and a 3.5 pound brake. And that just, oh, awesome solid reset, and fairly short too, and bang. And all those things, when you add this up, equates to a shooting experience that you will come to appreciate. Now, what all these guns have in common is, of course, the Glock engineering, and they're all chambered in 9mm, so this does make this an apples-to-apples comparison in terms of the shooting experience. And so the other thing that they do share is that they all can utilize the same Glock 17 type magazines. That's actually a cool thing, so if you don't want to pay over $100 each for the MBX magazines that come with the DC9R, you can certainly use factory mags, and I would probably use those for range or dry fire mags on this gun if you actually want to shoot it more, and then probably keep your metal ones for such a nicer occasion. And finally, what they all share together is that they have the Glock engineering fundamentals. It's simple to operate, and you have the low bore axis. What that actually does is it creates less muzzle flip, making it seem like a much flatter shooting experience. And when you combine all those features together, this is a gun that you can shoot fairly accurately and aggressively. And so that leads us into our next segue, which would be the actual shooting experience and how they did against each other. But before I do that, I would ask that if you do like this video, please hit that like button, as that really helps me out a lot. And you're gonna wanna subscribe, because I'm gonna be coming out with more series like the 2011 and maybe other platforms as well as we go along. So you're gonna wanna check that out. If you'd watched one of my other shootout videos where I did the Canik Rival, the Rival S, and the Walther Q5 steel frame, you'll learn that I did a lot of my tests between 12 and 25 yards. A lot of the short aggressive stuff was done at 12 yards, so the single and weak hand. I had spent already quite a bit of time shooting all these guns. Each one of these guns I shot in a competition, and I put extensive rounds through them at this point. And so I was fairly comfortable with all three. And the one thing is, as I got comfortable with all three, I learned that I can shoot them as precisely and accurate as one or the other, within anything within about 15 yards. And so I decided to get a little bit more aggressive with my test in prior videos. And so what I ended up doing first is that I ended up going to 15 yards. I started out doing control pairs and working up to one sight picture doubles. And I'm glad I did that, because when I started to go out to 25 is when I saw the variances in between all three. Even at 15 yards, the Zev OZ9 and the DC9R were very similar. I was able to split low 20s with about 4 to 6 inch groups on the target. And if we were to say that as a comparison basis, that would be null and void, because I'm getting the same shooting experience at that range and distance. Now the Glock 45, because it doesn't have either the ported barrels or the comps, and it is lighter, I do have to work a little bit harder to manage the gun and shoot it fundamentally. And so even at that range, at 15 yards, I had to slow my splits down to about 25 to 27 splits. But the cool thing is, if you're familiar with a USPSA A zone, which is about 4 inches wide and about 10 inches tall, I was able to get all my shots in there. And for the purpose of competition and even self-defense, that's more than acceptable. Now let's talk about my first test. It's actually going to be a bill drill at 25 yards. Now, if you're not familiar with the bill drill, that's either you shoot from low ready or you draw from the holster and shoot 6 rounds at the target as quickly as possible. Now, because I didn't have a holster for all three or identical draw positions, I felt that it was fair to take a step in and shoot from low ready. Now, here's the thing. I felt a bill drill was just kind of meh, because what I really want to test in this test is the controllability, the accuracy, and the manipulation of the guns. To spice it up, what I actually was going to do is start unloaded, and then I was going to use the factory magazines that came with them. So if you'd seen some other videos, I was using some extended base pads for larger round capacity, but I'm going to exclude that in particularly just this test, because I feel if this comes this way from the box, you should see how they actually perform. And so I'm going to start unloaded, and then I'm going to load the gun, shoot 6 rounds as quick and accurately as possible as I can at that range. Then I'm going to do a mandatory reload and shoot 6 more. And the results weren't too surprising, because the gun that ended up winning that competition was the DC9R with a final hit factor of 5.482. Now, if you want to see the further details of the actual time and the actual hits, I'll leave that in my blog and the description to my website so you can check that out. Now, following that was no surprise, this being the Zev OZ9 with a hit factor of 4.943. Oddly enough, this is why we use hit factor scoring, because we can balance the points on the USPSA target with the time. If you're not familiar with that, you just add up all the points and then divide it by the time, and that remaining number is your hit factor. The higher it is, the better. And the Zev OZ9 came in at 4.943. Oddly enough, I was just slightly faster than the DC9R, and I would have to attribute that because manipulating a much lighter gun can actually equate to faster reloads and getting back quicker on target. And between the lightweight and the balance and the ported barrels, I was able to split nearly about the same as the DC9R at that range. And so I did pick up a little time. However, being a light gun, I didn't quite have the controllability like I did with the DC9R because of the added weight it has. And so because of that, I ended up losing a few points on accuracy, and so that's what gave it a lower hit factor and giving the DC9R the win on this one. Now, humbly coming in third was the Glock 45 with a hit factor of 4.611. Now, the reason for the low score wasn't because of accuracy, believe it or not. I actually had the same hits as I did with the DC9R, but because the gun was so much lighter and I knew I had to work so much harder, what I reverted to was shooting to my fundamentals. I ended up shooting it significantly slower, as you'll see in the footage. And the cool thing is that if you were to think of this from a defensive standpoint, it'd still be more than effective for what we're doing in that case. But for competition, every second and every hit counts. And so if we were thinking the competition mindset, we know where we'd go. But for the utilitarian use and accuracy, even at that range, the Glock 45 more than fits the performance bill. Now, for the final test of performance between all three, I wanted to bring back my 3 array test. And what that consists of are 3 targets that I have to shoot at with 2 rounds each. I choose to pick IPSC targets because they're a little bit more challenging. And what I ended up doing differently is placing these at much further distances, nearly double what I typically do, which is at 12 yards. Now these are at 25 yards, with the 2 left and right targets being at 25 yards and the close target being at 10 yards. And so what I'm looking for here is the speed of transitions, the maneuverability, and the controllability. Now, this is where having a lighter gun will actually have the advantage. Once I have this array set up, I end up doing 3 strings of fire, which I change the sequence each time of the targets I engage and add those times and points up. And then I calculate the total time and the total points added up, and that gives me my hit factor for this exercise. And so what I'm really emphasizing are the other attributes we tested, but now with multiple targets. So we're focusing on how well the gun transitions. I suspected that the lightweight guns would have an advantage, but the DC9R in my hands just feels so perfect that I really felt that I'd still be walking away with the win. This is where it gets interesting, because the DC9R actually fell short of my expectations, because I was expecting it to walk away with it as the clear winner. Of the 3 guns, the DC9R was the quickest in this exercise, but where I obviously lost it was in accuracy. And the reason for that is I remember going back to my journey back at the World Pistol Shoot with this gun, and if you heard my comments earlier in that experience, I talked about how I was a little overconfident shooting and I actually had to back that off. That actually rang true, particularly within this exercise, as I actually suffered on accuracy with this gun. Now, I can probably work at that and I can extrapolate the performance to beat these other 2 guns, but the thing is, on that first initial impression, when you go to these exercises, you can be a little overconfident, and I ended up pulling shots just a little bit to the left, and enough Charlies do add up to hurt you in this particular exercise. The hit factor ended up landing at 6.608. As I had said, this is going to get interesting. We're already saying that this didn't win. This actually finished 3rd in this particular exercise. It was a battle between these 2, and the hit factor difference was only 0.033 difference. That's 0.03 of a difference in points. That's really, really close. That's like almost a hair close. Now, again, this is attributed to my experience with them shooting and also my own skills. For this particular test, the lightweight attributes of this gun made transitioning these guns very effortless. The one thing I did have to remind myself is that I had to work a lot harder to shoot the Glock on this particular exercise, especially when I'm shooting controlled pairs at this range and distance, and I'm getting a little bit more aggressive on that 10-yard one. And the Zev OZ9 required less effort for me to do nearly the same performance in this particular exercise. Now, who ended up winning this one was the Zev OZ9. And again, by only 0.033, that's so marginal. And it more is a testament to how well I can adapt to each of the guns and what that is. And I'm confident that if I were to shoot these guns more, I'd probably have different results. What I want to equate this to you guys as the audience is, what does my dollars buy me? Does it buy me more performance, or does it buy me more gun in some other shape, way, or form? And for this particular test, it was so dead even close, because they have very similar attributes but very different shooting experiences. It still means that if you have the fundamentals, that you can still extrapolate any of the performance out of these guns. And so there you have it, guys. The Glock 45, the Zev OZ9 Hypercomp, and the DC9R. 3 totally different price ranges. And so before I kind of dive into what I prefer, I want to stop and say, well, let's talk about what's the intent and purpose of each gun then. With the Glock 45, you are just going to get more bang for your buck. If you're serious about consistently shooting, training, and you don't want to think heavily about the maintenance or even worry about the reliability, this is the gun for you. You can spend way more money on ammo and it's going to be 100%. It is definitely a Spartan in that sense that it will show up, do the job, and it will do it well. The Zev OZ9 Hypercomp, you pay more, but you do get more. You get a little bit more performance and you get just a little bit more styling. And there's just something to be said about how this gun feels in the hand. That extra difference that you're paying for does equate to a lot of hours of engineering to make you feel and evokes different performance. And that's what you're buying with the Zev OZ9. The DC9R is the ultimate execution of what you can actually extrapolate for performance out of the Glock platform. Now, this gun isn't about saying, hey, do I extract the most dollars out of it? Is it the best value? That's not what its intent is. Its intent is to actually give you something very exclusive, something very special that is designed to the highest specs and tolerances possible. Does it necessarily buy you a ton more performance? Not necessarily, but what it does buy you from a shooting experience is something completely different than these two or any other gun out there. And this gun is really about flexing, guys. I'll say it like it is. Like, if you want to carry this thing every day, I'm not sure I would. This thing is awesome because if you were to share it with your friends, they'd know this is something special. And as I mentioned in the previous video about this gun, it is an heirloom gun and it's something that you'll be proud to pass down to the younger generation and they'll appreciate it immediately. If you were to lock me in a room and say, you have to pick one of these guns in order to get out of it, I will tell you it's going to be the Zev OZ9 Hypercomp. I get the most value out of it in terms of performance. I can carry it every day because it's light enough, and I just love how the gun feels in terms of a confidence-inspiring shooting experience. I actually like to shoot this gun quite a bit and carry optics for IDPA, and man, can I split this thing aggressively and precisely. And so for those reasons, this gun is for me. Doesn't mean that in any way do I think the guns are any less value. No, not at all. I'm gonna be honest with you, I would be a buyer for the DC9R just because you will get no experience like no other, and you know, maybe it is quite a bit of an investment, but those are things that are important to me, is to reflect back and think about the journey of life and the things that you got enjoyment out of. That gun would ring that for me. Now, as you all know, this is my own gun. The Glock 45 is my gun I used to train, to practice with, and live with. This gun makes me better. So there you have it, guys. That's a shootout I have for you guys. And so until then, we will see you at the range.